The bitter wind of Alaska's Kodiak Range cut through the towering pines as 76-year-old Thomas Grayson trudged along a snow-covered trail, the crunch of ice beneath his boots the only sound for miles. Widowed and alone since the passing of his beloved wife, Eleanor, 3 winters ago, Thomas had chosen solitude over sorrow, retreating to the cabin they built together deep in the wilderness. The world outside was loud and fast, but here, among the silent trees and frozen creeks, he found a fragile kind of peace. His cabin, weather-worn but sturdy, rested at the edge of a frozen lake, its fireplace crackling with the warmth of old memories. A skilled carpenter, Thomas spent his days carving delicate patterns into reclaimed wood, keeping his hands busy and his mind quieter. But beneath the routine, something restless stirred. The forest was unpredictable, wild. It carried with it the thrill of uncertainty and the whisper of something waiting just beyond the trees. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened like fingers across the snow, Thomas paused mid-step. A strange sound, deep, guttural, laced with pain, echoed through the stillness. Every instinct told him to turn back, but he didn't. With a weathered axe slung over his shoulder and a heart that had seen too much to fear easily, Thomas pushed forward into the unknown. What he found that day, a creature in need, a moment of raw connection, would alter the course of his quiet life forever. And it all began with a single, haunting growl. Thomas crept through the forest, each step deliberate, his breath fogging in the frigid air. The growl came again, closer now, ragged with agony. Rounding a thicket of snow-laden brush, he stopped cold. Just feet away, a massive grizzly lay in the powdery white, her flank rising and falling in labored gasps. Her paw was caught in a cruel steel trap, blood soaking the snow in a dark, growing halo. Ice clung to her fur, and her dark eyes locked onto his, not with fury, but with a kind of exhausted desperation. Thomas's pulse pounded. One wrong move, and he could be dead. Yet something in those eyes, a flicker of trust, or maybe hope, held him. Slowly, he unslung the axe and knelt, hands trembling. From his coat pocket, he pulled out the remains of his breakfast, a chunk of bread, and tossed it toward her. She didn't lunge. She didn't growl. She sniffed, cautiously. Inch by inch, he worked closer, using a thick branch to press against the rusted trap's release. The metal groaned. Thomas gritted his teeth, pushing with all his might. With a loud snap, the jaws sprang open. The bear jerked back, free at last. But she didn't flee. She stared at him, unblinking. And in that moment, something ancient and powerful passed between them. 3 days later, as dawn's pale light crept across the frozen lake, Thomas stood at his cabin window sipping coffee, unsure why he felt uneasy. Then he saw her, emerging from the trees like a phantom of the forest. The grizzly. But she wasn't alone. 2 cubs flanked her, their steps clumsy, their small frames half hidden by snowdrifts. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The last time he'd seen her, blood dripped from her paw. Now she stood tall, wounded but proud, and carrying new life. Slowly, cautiously, she padded to the edge of the clearing. Then, to Thomas's disbelief, she lowered her head and dropped something at the edge of the snow. A fish, freshly caught. Its silver scales glinted in the morning light like an offering. Thomas stepped onto the porch, boots crunching on the frost. The bear didn't move. Her cub sniffed the air, eyes wide with curiosity, but stayed close to her side. Heart thudding, Thomas knelt near the fish. "You brought this for me?" he whispered. The bear gave a low huff, not aggressive, but almost acknowledging. The wind stilled. Time held its breath. In that surreal, wordless moment, Thomas realized he hadn't just saved a wild animal. He'd forged a bond that defied explanation. The storm arrived like a living thing. Snarling winds howled through the pines, shaking Thomas's cabin as snow slammed against the windows in violent bursts. He stoked the fire and settled into his chair, expecting another long night of isolation. But then, amid the blizzard's roar, came a sound that didn't belong. A scratch, urgent, desperate. He flung open the door, and there she was, the bear. Her fur was crusted with ice, her eyes wild and pleading. She growled low, then turned and limped toward the forest, pausing only to glance back. "What is it, girl?" Thomas shouted into the gale, but she was already moving. Heart hammering, he grabbed his coat, flashlight, and rifle, just in case, and plunged into the storm. The bear led him deep into the blinding snow, her shape a ghostly blur ahead. Branches whipped at his face, the cold bit through his clothes, and every step felt heavier than the last. Then he heard it. Faint cries, muffled sobs. He swept his light across a hollow and froze. 2 children buried in snow, shivering and half-conscious. A boy and a girl. Without thinking, Thomas dropped to his knees. "I've got you," he whispered, pulling them close. Behind him, the bear stood guard, a silent sentinel in the snow. The children, Lena and Max, recovered swiftly in the warmth of Thomas's cabin. Wrapped in blankets near the fire, they sipped broth with trembling hands, their wide eyes still dazed by the storm and the strange miracle that saved them. The next morning, as the blizzard eased, Thomas contacted the nearest ranger outpost by radio. By afternoon, a rescue team arrived, stunned to find the missing children safe, and even more stunned by Thomas's account of how he found them. But what truly captured their imagination was the bear. Word spread quickly through the nearby town of Kodiak Falls. A reclusive widower, a monstrous storm, a wounded grizzly who had returned not for revenge, but to guide him to lost children. Locals came to hear the story firsthand. Reporters followed. Cameras flashed as Thomas stood on his porch, weathered and quiet, recounting how the same bear he'd once saved had somehow repaid him in kind. Children listened wide-eyed. Adults whispered words like guardian and spirit of the forest. One photographer captured a shot of the bear watching from the trees, massive, solemn, and wild. That image became a symbol, gracing newspapers and conservation. Spring melted winter's grip from the Kodiak Range, but the story of the bear and the children refused to fade. What began as whispers became a movement. Locals, once skeptical of the wild, now spoke of the grizzly with reverence. It was Lena's father who first proposed it. A festival, not just to honor the rescue, but to awaken a deeper respect for the wilderness that had given them back their children. Thomas was hesitant. He had never stood in front of crowds. But when he saw the sketches children had drawn of the guardian bear and heard the emotion in their parents' voices, he agreed. That summer, beneath garlands of pine and soft lantern light, the Kodiak Spirit Festival was born. The town square brimmed with booths, wildlife artwork, and conservation speakers. But it was Thomas's voice that stilled the crowd. "She wasn't just an animal," he said, eyes shining. "She was a soul, and in her I saw something we've forgotten, that we don't own this land. We share it." The applause was thunderous, but the real magic came after, when Thomas stepped down and saw children playing in bear masks, their laughter echoing into the forest. The legacy was growing, wild, real, and unstoppable. The seasons turned, and so did time. Maddie's visits, once frequent and familiar, grew sparse. Thomas understood. Her cubs were growing, likely forging their own paths deeper into the wild. Still, each morning he'd glance toward the tree line, coffee in hand, hoping to glimpse her silhouette against the rising mist. On quiet evenings, he'd sit on the porch and speak to the wind as if she were listening. When he passed, peacefully, one golden autumn morning, the town mourned a quiet hero. But it wasn't just his rescue of the children that people remembered. It was the bond he'd formed with a creature most would fear. In his honor, the townspeople planted a grove of Sitka spruce near the edge of the forest, where his cabin once stood. They called it Grayson's Haven, a sanctuary for wildlife and reflection. A carved wooden statue of a bear, paw raised in silent greeting, stood at its heart. Visitors came from across the state to walk its trails, whispering stories of the man and the bear who saved 2 lives and reminded the world what compassion in the wild could look like. And sometimes, just beyond the trees, the shape of a great bear lingered, watching, remembering, always near. Throughout our lives, we often encounter moments that challenge our views on compassion, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between humans and nature. Just as Thomas Grayson discovered unexpected connections in the wild, we too can find hope in the least likely places when we open our hearts. His journey teaches us that selfless acts of kindness can create ripples of change, transcending the barriers between man and beast, and reminding us of our shared responsibility to protect and cherish life. Embracing the unpredictable beauty of existence means finding strength in vulnerability, trusting in the power of empathy, and learning that every encounter holds a lesson. In honoring the legacy of compassion and wild spirit, we celebrate the timeless truth: kindness knows no bounds. If you enjoyed this message, remember to like my video and share your thoughts. Your support inspires us all to live with heart and purpose. Stay inspired always.